Caitlin Clark, she is the greatest scorer college basketball has ever seen.
A deep one. You bet! Caitlin Clark!
The WNBA finally had momentum. Ratings were climbing. Arenas were selling out. Jerseys were flying off shelves. Media coverage was everywhere. For the first time in its history, the league wasn't fighting for attention. It was commanding it. And somehow, this might be the exact moment it all unravels. Because while fans were celebrating growth, something else was happening behind closed doors. Something tense. Something personal. Something that now has the potential to change the entire future of the league. Adam Silver, the most powerful executive in professional basketball, has gone quiet. Not just quiet, distant. The same commissioner who once said he would personally make sure a deal got done. The same man players publicly called on for support. The same voice that promised stability. Now, he's expanding the NBA. He's discussing billion-dollar valuations. He's planning new teams in Las Vegas and Seattle. And the WNBA players? They're threatening a strike. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about leverage. It's about public perception. It's about who really holds the power at the exact moment the spotlight is brightest. Because here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to say out loud. Did the WNBA players overplay their hand? Or is the league underestimating the very athletes fueling its rise? And where does Caitlin Clark fit into all of this? The one player fans believe can carry the future, yet can't control the present. The situation isn't simple. It's layered. It's strategic. It's emotional. And it's getting more dangerous by the day. Because once negotiations stop being private and start playing out in public, the damage isn't just financial. It's reputational. And that's when things spiral. But to understand how we got here, you have to rewind to the moment Adam Silver stepped in and said he would fix everything. That's where the Real story begins. There was a time, not that long ago, when players believed Adam Silver was their safety net. When tensions around the new CBA started heating up, the message from the WNBA was clear. They wanted involvement from the top. They wanted the NBA's commissioner to lean in. They believed his presence at the table would accelerate compromise. And publicly, Silver didn't push back. In fact, he did the opposite. He acknowledged the negotiations. He signaled that progress would be made. At one point, he essentially implied that a deal would get done. That stability would win. That cooler heads would prevail. For players like Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, vocal leaders in the union, this was validation. It suggested they weren't fighting alone. It suggested the NBA umbrella still meant protection. But here's what makes this twist so dramatic. When a commissioner says he'll step in, that's leverage. When that same commissioner slowly pulls back, that's a message. And the shift didn't happen overnight. It was subtle. At first, Silver simply wasn't as vocal. Interviews focused more on NBA growth. Expansion talk dominated headlines. Media rights negotiations for the NBA were front and center. Billion-dollar projections. Franchise valuations skyrocketing. Meanwhile, WNBA CBA updates grew quieter. Then came the 6-week pause. When the players pushed hard on revenue split demands, specifically the gross revenue share, the league took its time responding. 6 full weeks. In high-stakes negotiations, that's not accidental. That's positioning. And when the response came back, it barely moved the needle. Minimal concessions on revenue share. Adjustments around housing. Structural tweaks. But not the major financial shift the players were demanding. That's when something changed in the tone. Before, it felt collaborative. After that, it felt like a standoff. The players doubled down publicly. Messaging became more assertive, more direct. The word strike started surfacing more often. Not officially declared, but strategically floated. And while that escalation was happening, Adam Silver wasn't escalating with them. He wasn't holding press conferences about urgency. He wasn't publicly pressuring owners. He wasn't inserting himself into the headlines. He was talking about Las Vegas. He was talking about Seattle. He was talking about expanding the NBA. Now think about the optics. The NBA, already profitable, already dominant, preparing to grow. The WNBA, in its most visible era ever, preparing for a possible strike. Same umbrella. Very different energy. And that contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans started asking questions. If Adam Silver once promised involvement, why does it now feel like distance? If the league is on the brink of historic growth, Why does the commissioner seem more focused elsewhere? Some insiders believe it's strategic neutrality. Let the sides negotiate. Let the process play out. Others believe something more blunt. He saw the public tactics. He saw the escalating rhetoric. He saw the refusal to compromise on revenue structure. And he decided not to attach his credibility to a losing PR battle. Because make no mistake, public negotiations are dangerous. When union leaders post historic strike comparisons, when fans see threats around All-Star Weekend, when the tone shifts from negotiation to confrontation, executives notice. And Adam Silver is nothing if not calculated. He protects the NBA brand relentlessly. He moves carefully. He avoids emotional reactions. He operates in long-term strategy. So if he senses instability, if he senses reputational risk, if he senses that stepping in could tie him to a public failure, pulling back becomes the safest move. But here's the part that makes this more complicated. The players believed their leverage had never been stronger. Attendance up, ratings up, merchandise booming, Caitlin Clark effect in full swing. For the first time in league history, casual fans were paying attention consistently. Media debates were daily. Highlight clips were viral. From the players' perspective, this was the moment to demand structural change. Because leverage is strongest when visibility is highest. But leverage cuts both ways. Owners know that growth is recent. Owners know media deals fluctuate. Owners know profitability still isn't at NBA levels. And executives understand something unions sometimes gamble on. Momentum can cool fast. So when Adam Silver stepped back, it wasn't just silence. It was pressure. Because without the commissioner leaning in publicly, the WNBA players are negotiating directly with ownership without the symbolic backing they once expected. And that shift changes everything. It turns what felt like partnership into confrontation. It turns optimism into brinkmanship. It turns a negotiation into a test of who blinks first. And as both sides dig in, the public is watching. But that's not even the most volatile part of this story. Because the Real explosion didn't start with Silver's silence. It started with the money. And that's where the situation gets even more intense. Here's where everything stopped being symbolic and started being dangerous. The entire fight comes down to one word: revenue. Not popularity. Not respect. Not exposure. Revenue. And more specifically, how it's calculated. The players want a percentage of gross revenue. The league is offering a percentage of net revenue. That might sound like accounting jargon. It's not. It's power. Gross revenue is the total money brought in before expenses. Media rights, ticket sales, sponsorships, merchandise, everything counted at the top line. Net revenue? That's what's left after costs are deducted. Operating expenses, travel, marketing, arena leases, staff, infrastructure, investment costs. That difference is massive. If you agree to gross, you're betting on growth and scale. If you stick to net, you're protecting against losses. And this is where the divide became almost impossible to bridge. The players pushed hard for roughly 30% of gross revenue. They argue the league's valuation has skyrocketed. Expansion fees are rising. Media rights discussions are heating up. Corporate sponsors are entering the space at higher levels than ever before. From their perspective, this isn't charity. It's market value. They believe they are the product. They believe they are driving this surge. And they're not entirely wrong. But ownership sees it differently. Owners argue that the WNBA has historically operated at a loss. That growth is real, but fragile. That expansion, marketing, and infrastructure investments are still catching up to demand. They see gross revenue demands as a gamble. Because if growth slows, if ratings dip, if attendance plateaus, they're locked into percentages that could balloon expenses beyond comfort. And here's the part that escalated the tension even more. The league reportedly took 6 weeks to respond to the latest proposal. 6 weeks. In negotiation terms, that's a statement. That's saying, we're not rushed. That's saying, we're not cornered. That's saying, you don't have the leverage you think you have. When the response finally came back, the needle barely moved. There were adjustments around housing, tweaks to structural benefits, developmental player considerations. But the revenue split? Minimal change. And that's when the rhetoric hardened. Because once one side refuses to budge financially, pride enters the room. Players began framing it as fairness. Owners framed it as sustainability. Two completely different lenses. And then came the messaging war. The players made it clear. If the revenue split doesn't move, neither will they. The league made it clear. Gross revenue is a line in the sand. At that point, it stopped being negotiation. It became a test of endurance. And the public started picking sides. Some fans said, pay the players. They built this momentum. Others said, the league is finally growing, don't sabotage it. The timing made it volatile. Because for the first time, the WNBA wasn't fighting for relevance. It was trending. And that's what makes this moment so risky. If this negotiation happened 5 years ago, most casual fans wouldn't even notice. Now, it's daily conversation. And then another uncomfortable topic entered the discussion: compromise. Owners pointed to housing concessions as evidence they were bending. One-bedroom accommodations for minimum players. Studio support for developmental players. Structural support adjustments that previously weren't on the table. From ownership's perspective, that's movement. From the player's perspective, it's distraction. Because housing doesn't change the core battle, revenue share. And when interviews surfaced suggesting the players weren't willing to shift off the gross demand, critics began framing it differently. Not as advocacy, but as rigidity. That's when public perception started to fracture. Because negotiations in private are one thing. Negotiations on social media? That's another. The more public the fight became, the more risky it grew. And here's the strategic problem the union now faces. If they back down, it looks like weakness. If they don't back down, it risks escalation. And escalation in a growth phase is dangerous. Because momentum can stall faster than it builds. Owners are betting on long-term structure. Players are betting on present leverage. Neither wants to blink first. And hovering above all of it is Adam Silver, watching carefully. He understands leverage cycles better than almost anyone in professional sports. He knows when a union has peak power. He knows when ownership holds structural advantage. And right now, it doesn't look like he believes the players hold the stronger hand. Because if he did, he would be more publicly urgent. Instead, the silence continues. And while the revenue fight rages behind closed doors, the public tactics are getting louder. Which brings us to the next escalation. Because once strike rumors start surfacing, especially during a growth surge, you're not just negotiating anymore. You're gambling. And what the players posted next made that gamble very real. It's one thing to negotiate aggressively. It's another thing to threaten to stop the show. And that's exactly where this situation started heading. The word strike didn't appear overnight. It crept in slowly. First through whispers, then through interviews, then through social media posts that felt less like negotiation updates and more like signals. And once that word enters the conversation publicly, everything changes. Because a strike isn't just leverage. It's escalation. And the timing couldn't be more volatile. For the first time in years, the WNBA has sustained national attention. Rating spikes, packed arenas, viral clips, daily sports debate coverage. The league is finally trending beyond its core fan base. That's momentum. Now imagine freezing that momentum mid-climb. That's the gamble. One of the most telling moments came when the Players Association shared content referencing the 1964 NBA All-Star strike. That historic moment changed the structure of player representation forever. It became a symbol of labor power. But symbolism cuts both ways. Posting historical strike parallels during a live negotiation isn't subtle. It's a message. It says we're prepared. It says we're not bluffing. It says we're willing to go there. And that's where things start getting dangerous. Because strikes only work when the public sees you as justified. If fans feel you're fighting for survival, support grows. If fans feel you're fighting at the wrong moment, sympathy shrinks. And here's the complicated part. Many casual fans don't understand the revenue split debate deeply. They don't break down gross versus net. They don't calculate long-term operating structures. They respond emotionally. If the league shuts down right when new fans are getting invested, frustration becomes louder than solidarity. And frustration spreads fast. There are already rumblings online suggesting that if veterans walk, the league could lean heavily into rookies and replacement players. Whether realistic or not, the fact that it's even being discussed publicly weakens leverage. Because once the idea of moving on starts circulating, unity cracks. And here's the cold reality about strikes in professional sports. They hurt everyone. Players lose game checks. Owners lose short-term revenue. Sponsors get nervous. Broadcasters adjust programming. Momentum cools. Casual fans drift. And rebuilding lost momentum is far harder than building it the first time. The All-Star Weekend speculation made it even more intense. All-Star events are showcase moments. Media-heavy, sponsor-heavy, celebrity-heavy. Disrupting that platform isn't just symbolic, it's financial. But here's what makes this moment uniquely risky. The WNBA isn't striking from a position of decades-long dominance like the NBA did historically. It's striking during a growth surge that hasn't fully stabilized. That's like pulling the emergency brake while accelerating. You might prove a point, but you might also stall the engine. And the optics matter, because while WNBA strike discussions intensify, the NBA is discussing expansion. One league preparing to grow, the other potentially preparing to pause. Same umbrella, opposite trajectories. And Adam Silver sees that contrast clearly. He knows that if a strike happens, the narrative shifts from empowerment to instability. Media headlines won't read "Players demand fair share." They'll read "League chaos during growth surge." That's brand damage. And brand damage spreads fast. This is where the internal pressure rises too. Not every player benefits equally from a strike. Veterans with established financial security may weather it better. Younger players, minimum contract players, developmental players, they feel immediate strain. If checks stop, tension builds inside the locker room. Unity becomes harder to maintain. And once unity fractures, leverage evaporates. That's why this isn't just about courage. It's about calculation. Are the players prepared for the possibility that public sentiment turns? Are they prepared for the possibility that owners dig in further? Are they prepared for the possibility that Adam Silver does not intervene? Because if they strike expecting emergency rescue, and it doesn't come, the power dynamic shifts permanently. But here's where the story takes an even more complicated turn. Because in the middle of escalating rhetoric, one voice sounded very different. And that contrast is starting to reshape public perception. While some players talk about drawing lines in the sand, one of the league's most visible stars is talking about compromise. And that's creating a narrative split nobody expected. In the middle of all this noise, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't escalate. She didn't threaten. She didn't post strike symbolism. She said something simple. We have to find a compromise. We need to play basketball. That's it. And somehow, that sentence changed the tone of the entire conversation. Because while union leaders were doubling down on revenue demands, while social media debates were getting sharper, while strike rumors were heating up, Caitlin Clark sounded calm, measured, focused on the game itself. And whether intentional or not, that contrast became powerful. Now let's be clear. Caitlin Clark is part of the Players Association. She's not publicly opposing her peers. She hasn't broken ranks. She hasn't attacked union leadership. But tone matters. And her tone felt different. It felt grounded. It felt practical. It felt like someone aware of the moment the league is in. And fans noticed immediately. Because in high-conflict situations, the public instinctively looks for the steady voice. The person who seems least emotional. The person who seems focused on forward motion. And right now, Clark fits that mold in the eyes of many casual fans, which creates an uncomfortable narrative. Not necessarily true, but powerful. The narrative that the rookies, especially the headline rookies, are here to hoop, while the veterans are here to fight. That perception isn't entirely fair. But fairness doesn't control headlines. Contrast does. And Caitlin Clark represents contrast. She represents growth. She represents ratings spikes. She represents sold-out arenas. She represents new fans who weren't watching 5 years ago. So when she speaks about compromise, it carries weight beyond just words. It sounds like stability. And stability is attractive during chaos. That's why this situation is more complicated than it looks. Because the league's most marketable star is inadvertently becoming the symbol of moderation. Not because she declared it, but because she didn't escalate. In intense labor disputes, silence can be louder than shouting. Now here's where this gets even more layered. Caitlin Clark's rise didn't just increase viewership. It shifted economic perception. Sponsors care about eyeballs. Broadcasters care about ratings. Owners care about valuations. Clark's presence has influenced all three, which means her positioning inside this dispute carries symbolic financial weight. If she appears aligned with escalation, it strengthens union optics. If she appears aligned with compromise, it strengthens ownership optics. Right now, She appears focused on playing, and that lands closer to compromise in public interpretation. Again, not because she said anything radical, but because she didn't. And here's the deeper tension. If a strike happens during her early prime years, the league risks stalling the exact momentum she helped generate. That's not anti-union. That's timing awareness. And timing is everything in sports growth cycles. There's also a generational layer forming quietly beneath the surface. Rookies entering a league during peak attention. Veterans who endured lean years demanding structural fairness. Two completely understandable perspectives, but different emotional foundations. Veterans may feel this as the moment to secure long-term change. Rookies may feel this as the moment to capitalize on opportunity. Neither side is wrong, but the emotional motivations differ. And if negotiations drag into disruption territory, those differences could become louder internally. Because here's the uncomfortable question. If momentum dips because of a strike, who absorbs the backlash first? The visible faces, the stars, the rookies. And that's where Caitlin Clark becomes both symbol and shield. Fans already frame her as the future. They already frame her as the reason ratings surged. So if instability stalls growth, critics will say the league fumbled its biggest opportunity. That narrative won't mention revenue formulas. It will mention timing. And in timing conversations, Clark's name will surface again. This is why Adam Silver's silence and Clark's tone create a fascinating parallel. Silver, strategic quiet. Clark, composed messaging. Both calm, while the negotiation rhetoric intensifies elsewhere. And public perception is starting to cluster around that calm, which is dangerous for union leverage. Because public sympathy fuels bargaining power. If sympathy fractures, pressure shifts. Now here's the part no one says out loud. If fans begin believing the league can move forward primarily around its young stars, veteran leverage weakens. Replacement conversations, even speculative ones, gain oxygen. And once the public believes the product can survive without certain players, the negotiation landscape changes permanently. That's why this moment isn't just about money. It's about narrative control. And right now, the narrative is splitting into two lanes: escalation and evolution. And Caitlin Clark, intentionally or not, is standing in the evolution lane. But this story doesn't end with tone. Because underneath the surface, something even more destabilizing is happening. The fan base itself is starting to divide. And once fans divide during a labor dispute, everything becomes harder to predict. Labor disputes are supposed to be players versus owners. But this one, it's turning into fans versus fans. And that might be the most dangerous development of all. At the beginning of the CBA tension, public sympathy leaned heavily toward the players. The narrative was simple: growing league, underpaid athletes, fairness conversation, easy to support. But the longer negotiations dragged on, the more complicated it became. Once revenue split percentages entered the discussion, gross versus net, most casual fans tuned out of the details. They didn't calculate profit margins. They didn't analyze valuation models. They responded to tone. And tone started shifting. Strike speculation. Public posts referencing historic work stoppages. Social media exchanges that felt less strategic and more confrontational. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of unifying around the players, the fan base began fragmenting. Some fans doubled down. Pay them what they're worth. Others began saying something very different. Don't mess this up. That sentence started popping up everywhere. Don't mess this up. Meaning, don't stall the growth. Don't freeze the momentum. Don't damage the opportunity. Because for many new viewers, the WNBA isn't a decades-long loyalty story. It's a recent discovery, a fresh attachment, a new habit forming. New habits are fragile. If a season pauses, if headlines shift to chaos, if games disappear for weeks, new fans don't always wait patiently. They drift. And once they drift, bringing them back costs exponentially more effort. That's the fear simmering beneath the surface. But here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Replacement talk. Even if unrealistic, even if emotional, even if reactionary. The fact that fans are openly discussing moving forward with rookies or development-heavy rosters reveals something deeper. They believe the league's growth is star-driven, not veteran-driven. That perception, whether accurate or not, shifts leverage dramatically. Because leverage in sports comes from scarcity. If fans believe certain players are irreplaceable, power increases. If fans believe the product survives regardless, power weakens. And right now, a segment of the audience believes the future is tied more to emerging stars than established veterans. That's a dangerous belief for union unity, because internal solidarity depends on shared strength. If younger players quietly calculate risk differently, if minimum salary players fear missing checks, if star rookies fear stalled momentum, that tension may not explode publicly, but it simmers privately. And simmering tension in a union negotiation is unstable. Now add social media amplification to the equation. Every rumor spreads instantly. Every clip becomes context. Every comment fuels narrative. When someone says, "We don't care, bring in replacements," even jokingly, it spreads. When someone says the league can't survive without this generation, that spreads too. And the louder the extremes get, the harder it becomes to maintain middle ground. Because middle ground doesn't trend. Extremes trend. That's the climate this negotiation is happening inside. Not quiet boardrooms. Not private bargaining rooms. Public arenas. With fans choosing sides in real time. And here's the brutal truth about divided fan bases. Owners watch sentiment closely. Broadcasters watch sentiment closely. Sponsors watch sentiment closely. If public support fractures, corporate pressure shifts. And corporate pressure influences negotiations faster than emotional speeches. If advertisers sense instability, they hesitate. If broadcasters sense programming risk, they adjust. And once external pressure builds, both sides feel it. This isn't theoretical. We've seen it in other leagues. Momentum is oxygen. Disruption cuts airflow. Now here's the irony. The players are fighting for a larger piece of a growing pie. But if growth slows because of escalation, the pie shrinks before it's fully baked. That's the gamble. And gamblers must be certain of their leverage. Are the players certain? Are the owners certain? Because if either side misreads the moment, the consequences won't show up immediately. They'll show up 6 months later, a year later, in sponsorship negotiations, in media renewals, in attendance plateaus. And that's why this moment feels so tense. Not because either side is wrong, but because timing is razor thin. Growth windows in sports don't stay open forever. They surge, they stabilize, or they stall. Right now, the WNBA is at surge level, and surge phases are fragile. The fan fracture is proof. Some fans want revolution. Some want stability. Some want patience. Some want immediate change. That division weakens collective pressure. And weakened collective pressure makes negotiations colder. Which brings us back to Adam Silver. Because while fans argue online, while players debate internally, while owners hold the revenue line, he's focused on expansion. Expansion is optimism. Expansion is confidence. Expansion is long-term vision. And that contrast might be the loudest message of all. But this situation hasn't reached its peak tension yet. Because if neither side backs down, the next phase isn't just rumor. It's action. And action changes everything. At some point in every labor dispute, the conversation shifts from "can this be solved?" to "what happens if it isn't?" That's where this situation is drifting. Because right now, both sides are holding firm. The players are anchored to gross revenue share. The owners are anchored to financial protection. Adam Silver is anchored to distance. And when everyone is anchored, something has to snap. So let's walk through it. If the players strike, games pause. Immediately, national broadcasts disappear from schedules. Arena momentum cools. Casual fans, the ones just forming habits, move on to other sports, other entertainment, other storylines. Sponsors begin reassessing activation campaigns. Broadcasters shift programming. Social media narrative flips from growth surge to league turmoil. And the longer it lasts, the more expensive it becomes, not just financially, but reputationally. But here's the nuance. Strikes are designed to apply pressure quickly. If public sympathy leans strongly toward players, owners feel it fast. If public sympathy fractures, pressure softens. And this is where the current fan divide becomes critical. Because a strike only works if the public believes it's necessary. If even a sizable minority believes it's mistimed, the pressure doesn't hit as hard. Now flip the scenario. If owners initiate a lockout, the optics shift dramatically. Players become victims in public perception. Owners absorb immediate backlash. And that's riskier for ownership in a growth phase. So a lockout feels less likely. Which means if disruption happens, it probably starts with the players. And that reality increases the stakes for them. Now here's another layer nobody talks about publicly. Replacement preparation. Leagues don't discuss it loudly, but contingency planning always exists. Developmental pipelines. International talent pools. Emergency roster flexibility. Even if it's only a short-term bridge, the mere existence of contingency planning weakens strike leverage. Because once fans believe the show can go on, the urgency decreases. And urgency is everything in labor leverage. Now think about this strategically. The WNBA is currently experiencing a rare media alignment moment. Debates on national sports shows, regular social media trends, celebrity attendance, cross-league crossover coverage. That kind of alignment doesn't happen often. If a strike interrupts that cycle, rebuilding that alignment later won't be automatic. Momentum is emotional, and emotional momentum fades faster than structural growth. Owners know that. Players know that too. That's why this is such a dangerous standoff. Both sides are aware of the timing. Both sides believe the moment strengthens their argument. Players believe, now is when we're most valuable. Owners believe, now is when disruption hurts the most. Same timing, opposite interpretation. And then there's Adam Silver's calculation. If the strike happens and public sympathy leans neutral or divided, he doesn't have to intervene immediately. If the strike happens and public sympathy overwhelmingly backs players, then intervention pressure rises. Right now, the sentiment landscape is murky, divided, fragmented, unpredictable. That uncertainty makes escalation harder to forecast. Now let's consider the long-term brand damage scenario. If disruption lasts weeks, the league's growth narrative pauses. If disruption lasts months, the league's credibility wobbles. Sponsors who just increased investments hesitate next cycle. Broadcasters renegotiate with caution. Expansion enthusiasm cools. And here's the brutal truth about sports economics. Confidence drives valuation. Instability deflates it. So this isn't just about this season. It's about how investors perceive the league's stability over the next decade. That's why neither side wants to blink, but also why neither side wants to leap. They're standing on a narrow ledge, and ledges don't allow missteps. Now here's where the internal dynamic becomes critical again. If strike discussions intensify and checks are threatened, some players will quietly calculate differently. Minimum salary players may feel strain faster. International players may consider overseas options. Rookies may worry about momentum loss. Veterans may feel urgency to secure structural gains now. Different financial realities inside one union. That diversity of circumstances makes unified escalation harder than it appears from the outside. Because solidarity is strongest when incentives align. Right now, incentives are similar, but not identical. And that subtle difference could shape the final outcome. Now step back and look at the full picture. NBA expansion conversations. WNBA revenue conflict. Strike rumors escalating. Fan base dividing. Caitlin Clark positioned as calm. Adam Silver positioned as distant. Owners positioned as financially guarded. Players positioned as financially assertive. This isn't just negotiation anymore. It's a power recalibration moment. And recalibration moments don't resolve quietly. They resolve decisively. The only question is, who absorbs the hit? Because someone always does. But this still isn't the deepest layer. Because beneath revenue splits and strike threats lies something even more fundamental. The valuation illusion. And once you understand that, the entire conflict looks different. Here's the part that makes this entire situation more complicated than social media debates suggest. The WNBA is being talked about like a billion-dollar league. Valuations are rising. Expansion fees are climbing. Media partners are showing increased interest. Franchise prices are higher than ever. On the surface, that screams growth. But valuation and profitability are not the same thing. And that distinction sits at the center of this standoff. Valuation is future belief. Profitability is present reality. When people say the league is worth more now, they're talking about projections, market momentum, media visibility, brand optimism, investor confidence. Owners are investing in what the league could become. Players are negotiating based on what the league appears to be becoming. That subtle difference is everything. From the player's perspective, the surge feels tangible. Sold-out arenas, record viewership spikes, sponsorship buzz, cultural relevance increasing. So the logic becomes simple. If the league is rising in value, we deserve a larger share of that rise. And emotionally, that argument resonates. But ownership sees the spreadsheet differently. They see operating costs rising too. Travel investments, charter discussions, marketing expansions, infrastructure growth, front office scaling, expansion planning, and growth phases are expensive. Here's what often gets overlooked in growth economics. Rapid expansion periods frequently operate at thin margins or temporary losses, because reinvestment eats profit. So while valuation climbs, cash flow might not. That's the tension. Players see the spotlight. Owners see the reinvestment cycle. Both are technically correct. But negotiation doesn't reward technical correctness. It rewards leverage clarity. Now consider this layer. Media rights conversations are heating up around women's sports. That's real. Advertisers are seeing opportunity. Corporate brands are seeing alignment potential. But many of those larger contracts haven't fully matured yet. Projections are ahead of execution. And players want compensation based on where the league is heading. Owners want compensation structures aligned with where the league currently stands financially. Future versus present. Optimism versus caution. And in moments like this, timing matters more than ideology. If the league's next media deal explodes upward, the player's bet looks brilliant. If the league's next media deal underperforms projections, the owner's caution looks wise. The problem? No one has certainty yet. And negotiation without certainty becomes risk management. Here's another layer that complicates everything. Expansion hype. The NBA discussing Las Vegas and Seattle expansion adds psychological contrast. It makes the umbrella organization look flush with opportunity. But the NBA and WNBA, while connected structurally, operate under very different financial ecosystems. NBA franchises operate in an established multi-billion-dollar media rights environment. WNBA franchises operate in a growth stage environment. Same umbrella, different scale. Yet the optics blur that distinction publicly. So when fans see expansion talk and revenue disputes simultaneously, it creates emotional friction. How can one side be expanding while the other says there's not enough to share? But expansion is often about long-term positioning. Revenue share is about short-term allocation. Different timelines. Same headlines. That's the illusion. And illusions shape public perception more than spreadsheets ever will. Now here's the strategic danger for both sides. If players push hard based on projected future revenue that doesn't materialize as quickly as expected, structural strain follows. If owners underpay based on current caution while future revenue explodes, resentment deepens permanently. Either way, someone risks miscalculating the growth curve. And miscalculations during surge phases are costly. But here's the twist. The league's current growth isn't evenly distributed. Some markets are exploding. Others are stabilizing. Some games are drawing record numbers. Others remain modest. Growth concentration matters. Because if growth is star-driven, tied heavily to a handful of players, then long-term revenue distribution becomes more complex. Are negotiations reflecting broad league growth, or concentrated growth around a few headline stars? That question quietly influences ownership risk tolerance. Because if growth is concentrated, they may hesitate to restructure league-wide financial models based on what might be a peak cycle rather than a baseline. And that's where Caitlin Clark's presence becomes economically symbolic again. Her influence has amplified visibility dramatically. But visibility spikes can plateau. Ownership likely asks, is this sustainable? Or is this peak attention? Players likely respond. Sustainability requires investment and fair structure now. Again, both arguments have logic. But negotiation isn't about logic alone. It's about timing confidence. And right now, both sides are betting on different timelines. Players are betting the surge is permanent. Owners are betting the surge needs proof. And Adam Silver? He's betting on long-term umbrella stability, which explains his distance. He doesn't want to tie NBA expansion optimism to WNBA labor volatility, because investor confidence thrives on predictability. And predictability is fragile in moments like this. Now step back and look at the emotional reality. Fans hear billion-dollar valuation and assume abundance. Players hear growing league and assume upward redistribution. Owners hear growth cycle and assume reinvestment phase. Same data, different interpretation. And that's why this standoff feels so intense. Because it's not just about money. It's about belief in trajectory. And belief is harder to negotiate than numbers. But here's where everything converges. Belief doesn't matter if momentum collapses. Because if a strike interrupts the surge, if fans drift, if media attention cools, all projections shrink, and suddenly both sides lose. Which brings us to the final layer of this entire situation. The moment that will define whether this was strategic courage or strategic miscalculation. Every league has a moment that defines its future. Not a championship, not a viral highlight, not a record-breaking rookie season. A decision, a crossroads where timing, ego, leverage, and belief collide. This is that moment for the WNBA. Because right now, both sides are standing at the edge of something irreversible. If the players escalate and strike, they prove resolve. They show strength. They signal they won't accept incremental change. But they also risk freezing the exact momentum that strengthened their argument in the first place. If the owners concede significantly on gross revenue share, they signal partnership. They invest trust in long-term projections. But they also risk locking in financial structures based on growth that hasn't fully stabilized. And hovering above it all is Adam Silver, quiet, observant, calculating. He doesn't need to shout. His silence is strategic. Because intervention too early ties him to one side. Intervention too late ties him to fallout. So he waits. And waiting is pressure. The defining decision isn't just about revenue percentage. It's about which side believes more strongly in the league's future trajectory. Do the players believe growth is permanent enough to demand structural redistribution now? Do the owners believe growth is fragile enough to protect margins longer? Because this moment determines more than a contract cycle. It determines tone. If this ends in compromise, the league moves forward with momentum intact. If this ends in confrontation, scars remain. Scars don't always show immediately. They surface later. In trust. In future negotiations. In player-owner relationships. In fan confidence. And here's the deeper layer. This isn't just about money. It's about narrative control. Right now, the WNBA narrative is split. Growth story. Labor tension story. Rookie surge story. Strike speculation story. Expansion contrast story. Whichever narrative wins in the next few weeks will shape public perception for years. If compromise happens, the story becomes league matured. If disruption happens, the story becomes league destabilized during peak growth. And perception drives investment. Investment drives opportunity. Opportunity drives long-term power. That's the cycle. Now let's zoom in one last time. Caitlin Clark representing growth and future visibility. Veteran leaders representing structural fairness and overdue equity. Owners representing financial caution and sustainability. Adam Silver representing long-term umbrella stability. Fans divided between urgency and patience. This isn't heroes versus villains. It's competing priorities during a surge phase. And surge phases are the most fragile chapters in sports evolution, because growth can either harden into foundation or crack under pressure. And that's why this decision matters so much. If no one blinks, disruption becomes real. If someone blinks, criticism follows. There is no clean victory here, only strategic trade-offs. And that's what makes this moment historic. The WNBA isn't fighting for attention anymore. It's fighting for structure. And structure determines everything that comes next. The next media deal, the next expansion, the next generation of stars, the next revenue split, the next fan wave. All of it flows from how this ends. So the question isn't just, will there be a strike? The real question is, will this be remembered as the moment the league secured its future, or the moment it stalled its own rise? Because in sports, timing isn't just important. It's everything. And right now, the clock is ticking. The WNBA stands at its most visible point ever. More eyes, more money, more conversation, more expectation. And in the middle of that spotlight, a negotiation has turned into a power recalibration. Adam Silver stepping back, players stepping forward, owners holding firm, fans splitting, Caitlin Clark rising, veterans demanding structure. No matter how this ends, the league won't feel the same afterward. Because moments like this redefine balance. If compromise wins, growth accelerates. If conflict wins, momentum cools. And if miscalculation wins, everyone loses. This isn't just about 30%. It's about trajectory. It's about belief. It's about whether this surge becomes a foundation or a flash. And the next move decides that. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think the players are pushing at the right time? Or do you think the league risks damaging its own momentum? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want real breakdowns that go deeper than headlines, hit subscribe right now. Because this story isn't over. And when the next move happens, you'll want to understand exactly what it means.